Alright, Chapter 7 starts on page 572. Keep in mind I'm looking at my notes. My apologies if that annoys you. The economic growth of the 50s, we see wonderful growth during this time period. Unemployment is down 5%, down to 5%. Inflation was at a low of 3%. This is fantastic news for a country who had just 2 decades ago struggled with one of the worst depressions ever known. So why was it so good? Well, government spending was high, which for this particular era was very good. You see a population growth of the baby boomers, which you guys are familiar with. These are children born in the U.S. between 1946 and 1964, mainly due to the post-war return of those GIs. There's a 20% in population growth just due to this alone. It created an increased consumer demand and economic growth. So skipping ahead, if you'll look on page 576, we'll talk about the civil rights era. Eisenhower, he is, in his first term, he does a number of positive things. He desegregates public services in D.C. He desegregated Navy yards and Veterans Hospital. He supported a civil rights bill. He believed that it was a personal matter, though. He did not really see that federal intervention was going to fix it. But he was wrong. This is something that desperately needed the the federal intervention. The court is ultimately probably how it all worked out. The NAACP in 1876 had brought the suit of Plessy versus Ferguson. This was what established separate but equal. Further test cases targeted schools in Kansas, Delaware, South Carolina, Virginia, as well as in D.C. This is where you see the introduction of a power player in the NAACP by the name of Thurgood Marshall. Brought a case to the United States Supreme Court in 1952 by the name of Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas. The justices unanimously voted against segregation. Enough was enough. It's here that they decided that separate but equal is not equal. They said that it was rarely enforced and it caused an inferiority complex to black young children. So Southern schools, they drug their feet. By the end of 56, 6 Southern states still had not desegregated. So this is where we see the civil rights movement really take off. There's, again, kind of like with the wars, there's several points that historians argue about. This is the beginning of the modern civil rights movement or the beginning of a world war. This is one that, I could see it coming either way. There's a number of different points that you could say this is the beginning. Your book talks about Montgomery, Alabama, and the bus boycott that was sparked in December 1955 when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man. The bus rules were segregated black and white. The bus driver told her to move or she'd be arrested, and she said, fine, arrest me. And they did. The reaction was swift and it was thorough. The black community decided at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church that they were going to no longer ride Montgomery buses, and they did so for just over a year. They nearly drove the bus system in Montgomery completely out of business because that was such a large percentage of who actually was riding it. Supreme Court in December 20th, 1956 found against Montgomery, said that the separate but equal doctrine can no longer be safely followed as a correct statement of law. It officially ended the bus boycott in Montgomery, and it opened the door for the civil rights movement. In Little Rock in 1956, this is another moment in time that people contest might have been the beginning of this movement. Eisenhower proposed the Civil Rights Act. It had made concessions to get Southern states to support it, created a Civil Rights Commission, as well as a division within the Justice Department. It's at Central High School there in Little Rock, where 9 black students tried to enter and enroll at the high school. It made no sense to them that they had to walk past just a block away from their home, this nice white high school, and walk blocks over dangerous train tracks, and then catch a bus to their black, very inferior school. And so they were fighting against this. Eisenhower had to get involved because the governor of Little Rock intervened by calling the National Guard to block these young men and women from the school. Eisenhower sent 1,000 troops to defend and protect the students. They enrolled, and the troops remained for the remainder of the year. the young men and women that were involved in this situation, it's really cool to go back and read their remembrances of it or to watch clips of their interviews. It's really remarkable. They have some very positive things to say, particularly about the National Guard that Eisenhower employed to make them or give them that opportunity. They talked about how they endured so much just so these kids could go to school. Beyond that, we see a change in culture. You see the Beat generation come along. There's a more interest in a more personal religion. There's an interest in non-Western religions. You also see the entrance of one Jack Kerouac, who you need to know for your test. He wrote On the Road, which published in 1957. This is unconventional, void of punctuation, which drives me crazy, by the way. You also see a change in music and in film. You see the rise of Elvis. You have James Dean and his Rebel Without a Cause, Marlon Brando, as well as this antisocial behavior that parents feared but teens loved. In Chapter 8 on page 578, we see the elections of 1960, and this is where you see Richard Nixon coming up against JFK, or John F. Kennedy. Nixon kind of came across as uncertain and aloof, although he had a long political career, a very successful one, as a matter of fact. Kennedy, barely any time in the public eye, a very short and weak political career overall, but he came across as suave and sophisticated. Both in their 40s, both served in World War II. It's their first television debate that historians almost unanimously say basically sealed the deal for Kennedy. 70 million people watched. That's a lot of people, folks, to come together and watch something like this. Nixon looked sick. He looked very uncomfortable. He's sweating, uneasy. Kennedy, dashing, charming, couldn't say anything wrong. He just came across perfectly. Women loved him, and he won a massive amount of votes just with this. The election was close, but JFK won. With that, he took a similar approach to Eisenhower, bringing in with him the best and the brightest. He hired his brother, Robert, as the Attorney General. He brought in a Ford executive. He also brought in his own Secretary of State. He brought in an idea called the New Frontier, which was going to it looked a lot like some previous programs of more recent presidents, but he wanted to increase federal support for education, increase health care for the elderly, as well as urban renewal money. He helped pass the Housing Act, which was urban renewal money, as well as more Social Security benefits, and he created the Peace Corps and the Alliance for Progress. The Peace Corps is the group, it's still in existence today, sending out volunteers to third world countries to help improve the lives of those in poverty. And then the Alliance for Progress provided aid for Latin American countries, sort of the same thing, but it's here in our hemisphere. Also, he upped the NASA support there. He was convinced that we needed to beat the Russians, and he promised to land a man on the moon by the end of the 60s. At this point, the Russians were beating us in space, and so Kennedy really stepped up his game with his NASA support. It's here that the U.S. sent Alan Shepard Jr. up into space on May of 1961, and then John Glenn orbited the Earth in 1962. Continuing our discussion of the civil rights, you see in Mississippi in 1961, the University of Mississippi blocked James H. Meredith from enrolling. Essentially, finally, they send in marshals to escort him, but he's attacked by a white mob, and these federal troops are sent in. February of 1960, we see the first sit-ins. Four college students in North Carolina entered a whites-only diner and demanded service. You also see the rise of SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Worked with MLK for some time, organized sit-ins, kneel-ins, which they were going into white churches and kneeling. Also wade-ins, which are white pools where they would go in and interrupt the white-only pool situation. You also see the rise of CORE, which is Congress for Racial Equality, and the Freedom Riders, which you've likely all heard of as well. Black and white riders on Greyhound buses trying to challenge segregation, and you often see violence here. Anniston, Alabama, you see a firebombing. Birmingham, there's an attack. Montgomery, there's an attack. Kennedys tried to support the civil rights movement, but really were more interested in trying to steer them towards a voter registration effort, not so much towards all of these other issues. Kennedy's also known for establishing the Green Berets and the Navy SEALs. Both of these were experts in guerrilla warfare and small military actions, ultimately become very helpful in Vietnam. He's also known for his role in Cuba in the Bay of Pigs invasion. Make sure to read about that in April of 1961. Also, Berlin. He has a tentative relationship at best with Nikita Khrushchev. Met with Kennedy to discuss Germany, wanting to open up the borders to hopefully help the people that were fleeing off into the West. Khrushchev wanted to block it off, as Ch6-7 had escaped by 1961, and he threatened to build the Berlin Wall, which ultimately he does. Started as barbed wire fence, and it ended up being 96 miles long, 12 feet high, 116 watchtowers, 20 bunkers, mesh fencing, signal fencing, anti-vehicle trenches, barbed wire at the top, dogs on long lines, shoot-to-kill order. It's a 30-year reminder of how communism did not work. They have to trap their own people into their communist nation for people to stay there. And then you also see that he has a large role in the Cuban Missile Crisis in the fall of 1962. Vietnam, of course, page 585, is a part of this as well, as we see our role there increasing quite a bit. The Kennedys end up trying to support No Diem, who is the South Vietnamese leader, and even though he really was not the right fit, he is a wealthy, Catholic, French-educated Vietnamese leader. The South Vietnamese did not get him, he did not get them, and he didn't care. And so the United States get involved in this situation where we're supporting him. He's a weak leader, but we see him as, well, he's not communist. So we dramatically increase our role in that. By November 63, a coup ends up killing Diem. And we see that escalating into something far worse. November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy is assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald while visiting Dallas, Texas. Oswald is arrested and then killed 2 days later by Jack Ruby, and Lyndon Baines Johnson comes to office as president. Just a moment, I'll come back with the next section.